The silver iPhone sat on my kitchen counter like a forgotten artifact from another life. Marcus had been gone for 3 months, but there it was, plugged into the charger behind the coffee maker where he used to leave it every morning. I stared at it, my coffee growing cold in my hands, wondering how I'd missed it all this time. The divorce papers were already signed. The house was mine now, along with the mortgage payments I could barely afford on my teacher's salary. Marcus had taken his clothes, his golf clubs, his collection of vintage vinyl records, and his explanations with him. But somehow, in his rush to start his new life, he'd left behind the one thing that might actually tell me the truth. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My finger hovered over the home button. The lock screen showed 17 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, and dozens of text messages from contacts I'd never seen before. The phone buzzed in my hand, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. Another message from someone named Derek. "Where are you? Sarah's asking questions. This is getting messy." Sarah. That name hit me like ice water. Sarah Martinez, the 28-year-old marketing coordinator from Marcus's accounting firm. The one with the perfect Instagram feed. And the laugh that somehow managed to be both musical and grating. The one Marcus had insisted was just a colleague every time I mentioned how often her name came up in his work stories. I shouldn't have done it. I knew that even as my thumb moved to swipe the emergency button and somehow bypassed the lock screen entirely. Maybe it was muscle memory from all those mornings I'd grabbed his phone to turn off his alarm when he was in the shower. Maybe it was 3 months of sleepless nights wondering what I'd done wrong. Maybe it was the way he'd looked right through me when he said he needed space to find himself while packing his bags. The messages opened like a book I'd never wanted to read. Derek, you can't just disappear on us now, the plan was foolproof. Sarah, baby, I know this is hard, but we're so close. Just a few more months and we'll have everything we dreamed of. My legs gave out. I slid down the kitchen cabinets until I was sitting on the cold tile floor, the phone trembling in my hands. There were hundreds of messages, going back over a year. Plans, timelines, discussions about my teaching schedule, my habits, my trust fund that I'd inherited from my grandmother and barely touched. She has no idea, Marcus had written to Sarah 6 months ago. Emma's always been naive about money. She thinks love conquers all. It's almost too easy. The room spun around me. I scrolled up, searching for the beginning, though part of me already knew I wouldn't like what I found. There it was, dated 18 months ago, right around the time Marcus had suggested we get married at the courthouse instead of having the wedding I'd been planning since I was 12. Sarah, are you sure she'll go for the quick wedding? Marcus, trust me, she's been so desperate to lock me down she'll sign anything. The prenup she thinks protects her assets actually gives me rights to half her inheritance if we're married more than 2 years. My lawyer made sure of that. Derek, and if she doesn't divorce you? Marcus, she will. I've got it all figured out. I'll make her so miserable she'll beg me to leave. Then I get half her money, Sarah gets her promotion to senior partner at the firm, and we all win. My coffee mug slipped from my other hand, shattering against the floor. The brown liquid spread across the white tiles like spilled secrets. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process that the man I'd loved for 3 years, the man I'd married in a simple ceremony at City Hall because he'd convinced me that big weddings were just for show, had orchestrated the destruction of my life like it was a business transaction. There were photos, screenshots of my bank statements that Marcus had somehow accessed, detailed notes about my daily routines, my friendships, my insecurities, a timeline labeled Operation Fresh Start that mapped out exactly how they would systematically isolate me, undermine my confidence, and drive me to initiate the divorce myself. Day 240, one message read, told Emma her new haircut makes her look desperate. She cried for an hour. Sarah says I need to be more subtle, but honestly, it's working. She's starting to question everything about herself. I remembered that day. I'd gotten highlights and a trim, feeling confident for the first time in months. Marcus had looked at me across the dinner table and said, with that smile that used to make my heart race, "Oh honey, what did you do to your hair? You look like you're trying too hard." I'd spent the rest of the evening in the bathroom, trying to figure out what was wrong with my reflection. Day 315, another message continued. Perfect fight about her sister's wedding. Convinced Emma that her family thinks I'm not good enough for her. She's pulling away from everyone now. Phase 2 complete. My sister Jenna's wedding. Marcus had started an argument about nothing and stormed out, leaving me to explain his absence to my entire family. I'd been so embarrassed, so sure that he was right about them judging him, that I'd barely spoken to Jenna for months afterward. I'd chosen him over my own sister because I thought he was hurt, thought he needed me to defend him. The messages kept coming, a year-long chronicle of calculated cruelty designed to break me down piece by piece. Every fight we'd had, every moment of doubt he'd planted, every time he'd made me feel small or stupid or unworthy, it had all been planned, choreographed, performed with Oscar-worthy precision. She's so isolated now, Marcus had written just 2 weeks before he left. No friends left, barely talks to her family. This is almost too easy. Sarah's getting impatient, but I told her we stick to the timeline. 2 years and 1 day, then I file. Clean and simple. But they'd been wrong about one thing. I hadn't filed for divorce, Marcus had. 2 years and 3 days after our wedding, claiming irreconcilable differences and asking for half of everything. I'd been so devastated, so convinced that I'd failed as a wife, that I'd signed the papers without even reading them properly. My phone, my actual phone, buzzed on the counter above me. A text from my lawyer. Emma, I need you to call me immediately. There's something wrong with the asset division in your divorce settlement. I looked down at Marcus's phone, still glowing with evidence of the most elaborate con I'd ever seen. They thought they'd won. They thought I was just another naive victim who'd hand over half her inheritance and slink away to lick her wounds in private. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't the same broken woman who'd signed those papers 3 months ago. I wasn't the same person who'd let them convince me I was worthless, friendless, alone. And I definitely wasn't going to let them get away with stealing from me. I stood up slowly, Marcus's phone still in my hand, and walked to my laptop. I had work to do. Phone calls to make. Evidence to gather. Because Marcus Thompson had made one crucial mistake in his perfect plan. He'd left his phone behind. I met Marcus Thompson on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 3 years before everything fell apart. I was grading papers at Riverside Cafe, my usual spot by the window where the afternoon light made the red ink less harsh on my students' essays. He was at the counter, arguing with the barista about whether they could make his coffee less bitter without actually changing anything about it. I should have seen the red flag there. The way he expected the world to bend to his preferences without him having to adjust anything about himself. But all I saw was a tall, dark-haired man in an expensive suit who looked completely out of place in my favorite neighborhood coffee shop. He caught me staring and smiled. Not the practiced smile I would later learn to recognize, but something that seemed genuine in the moment. "Rough day?" he asked, nodding toward the stack of papers covered in corrections. "Every day," I laughed. "Third-grade reading comprehension. They're either future Nobel Prize winners, or they've convinced me that humanity is doomed." He bought me a coffee and asked if he could sit down. Said he was new to the area, working at Henderson and Associates downtown. I was 26, had been teaching for 4 years, and lived in the same apartment I'd rented straight out of college. My life was comfortable, predictable, safe. Marcus was anything but safe. He was fascinating in the way that people become when they pay attention to you like you're the only person in the room. He asked about my students, my lesson plans, what made me want to teach. He listened when I talked about my grandmother Helen, who'd left me enough money to buy a house someday when I was ready to stop renting. He seemed impressed that I was saving it, not touching it, being responsible. I should have wondered why a stranger cared so much about my financial planning. Our first date was dinner at Giuseppe's, a little Italian place I'd mentioned in passing. He remembered everything I said, had an opinion about everything I cared about, agreed with my perspectives on education and politics and life. It felt like finding someone who understood me completely. Looking back now, I realize Marcus never told me much about himself. He deflected personal questions with charm and counter-questions. He was like a mirror, reflecting back exactly what I wanted to see. When I said I valued honesty, He talked about how refreshing it was to meet someone so genuine. When I mentioned wanting to travel someday, he shared elaborate plans for trips to Italy and Greece. When I said I wanted a family eventually, he got this dreamy look and talked about how lucky our kids would be to have me as a mother. The courtship was textbook perfect. He brought me flowers on Wednesdays because everyone expects them on Fridays. He remembered that I preferred tea to coffee in the evenings and always had my favorite chamomile blend waiting when I came over. He learned the names of all my students and asked about them regularly. He even started volunteering at the school's reading program, charming everyone from the principal to the lunch ladies. My family loved him. My sister Jenna said he was the first boyfriend I'd brought home who actually seemed interested in getting to know them instead of just tolerating them. My parents were impressed by his ambition, his manners, his obvious devotion to me. Even my grandmother Helen, before she passed away that spring, had pulled me aside at Easter dinner to say she approved. "He looks at you like you hung the moon, sweetheart," she'd said, squeezing my hand with her paper-thin fingers. "That's how your grandfather used to look at me." 6 months later, when the inheritance came through, Marcus was there to help me navigate the paperwork. He held me while I cried over losing the last connection to my grandmother's generation. He helped me research financial advisors and investment options. He suggested I keep the money separate from my regular accounts for tax purposes, and recommended his firm's estate planning attorney for setting up a trust. I thought he was protecting me. I thought he was being practical and responsible. I had no idea he was positioning himself for the long game. The proposal came exactly 1 year after we met, back at Riverside Cafe at the same table where we'd first talked. He'd somehow convinced the owner to let him decorate the corner with photos from our relationship, little memories I'd forgotten he'd even captured. The ring was perfect, a simple solitaire, exactly what I'd described wanting when we'd walked past jewelry stores and played the someday game. "I know it's fast," he said, down on one knee while the entire cafe applauded. "But when you know, you know. I want to build a life with you, Emma. I want to be the man you deserve." I said yes before he'd even finished the question. Planning the wedding should have been the happiest time of my life. I'd dreamed about it since I was little. The dress, the flowers, walking down the aisle toward the person I'd spend forever with. I had Pinterest boards and magazine clippings and a vision of celebrating with everyone we loved. But Marcus had other ideas. The venue I wanted was too expensive. The guest list I'd made was too big. The traditions I'd grown up with were outdated. One by one, he talked me out of everything I'd imagined, always with perfectly reasonable explanations that made me feel silly for wanting what I wanted. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "Baby, wouldn't you rather spend that money on our honeymoon?" he'd say when I showed him photos of reception decorations. "Or save it for the house we'll buy someday? Do we really need all these people we barely talk to?" He'd ask about my extended family and college friends. "Wouldn't it be more meaningful with just the people who really matter?" "These old traditions are so antiquated," he'd argue, when I mentioned wanting my father to walk me down the aisle or my sister to be my maid of honor. "We're modern people. We should create our own traditions." By the time we settled on a courthouse ceremony with just immediate family, I'd convinced myself it was what I wanted too. Marcus had a way of making his preferences seem like logical conclusions I'd reached on my own. He was so good at it that even now, knowing what I know, I can barely untangle which thoughts were originally mine. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. I wore a cream-colored dress I'd found on sale, carried a small bouquet of daisies, and promised to love Marcus Thompson for better or worse. He cried during his vows, talking about how I'd made him believe in love again, how he'd never felt as seen and appreciated as he did with me. His best man, Derek, took photos on his phone. I didn't recognize him then as the same Derek whose name would later appear in those text messages, coordinating the timeline of my destruction. Our honeymoon was a long weekend in Napa Valley. Marcus was attentive, romantic, everything a new husband should be. He toasted our future over dinner at a vineyard restaurant, talked about the house we'd buy, the children we'd have, the life we'd build together. He seemed genuinely happy, genuinely in love. Maybe he was, in his own twisted way. Maybe he'd convinced himself that loving me and conning me weren't mutually exclusive. Maybe he thought he could have both, my heart and my money. And somehow that would be enough. But even on our honeymoon, I caught glimpses of something that didn't quite fit. The way he'd step away to take phone calls, speaking in hushed tones. The way he'd quickly close his laptop when I walked into the room. The way he'd change the subject whenever I brought up specifics about our financial future. I explained it away. He was private about work, he was protective of our personal time. He didn't want business concerns to intrude on our romantic getaway. I had no idea that our romantic getaway was just another phase in his carefully orchestrated plan. I had no idea that while I was falling asleep in his arms, dreaming about our future, he was already counting down the days until he could walk away with half of everything my grandmother had worked her whole life to build. The foundation of our marriage was rotten before we'd even signed the papers. I just didn't know it yet. The shift started so gradually I almost missed it. 3 months after our honeymoon, Marcus began working later hours. Not dramatically at first. An extra 30 minutes here, a weekend morning there. When I asked about it, he'd kiss my forehead and explain that Henderson & Associates was expanding their client base, that he was up for a promotion, that the extra effort now would pay off for our future. "I'm doing this for us," he'd say, loosening his tie as he walked through the door at 9 o'clock on what used to be date night. "So we can have everything we've dreamed about." I believed him because I wanted to. Because the alternative that my new husband was already losing interest in spending time with me was too painful to consider. So I filled the empty evenings grading papers, planning lessons, and telling myself that this was just temporary. Just the adjustment period all couples go through. The first time I heard Sarah Martinez's name was on a Thursday in November. Marcus came home animated in a way I hadn't seen in weeks, talking about this brilliant marketing coordinator who'd just joined his team. She had innovative ideas about client outreach, fresh perspectives on brand management, and an MBA from Northwestern. "You should meet her sometime," he said over dinner. "I think you two would really hit it off. She's smart like you, but in a different way, more business-minded." I felt the sting of that comparison immediately. Smart like you, but in a different way. As if my intelligence was somehow lesser, more limited. I pushed the feeling down and smiled, asking interested questions about Sarah's background, her role at the firm, what made Marcus think we'd be compatible as friends. He lit up talking about her, the way he used to light up talking about me. Sarah became a regular character in Marcus's work stories. She'd suggested a new client retention strategy. She'd caught an error in a proposal that could have cost the firm thousands. She'd organized a team-building event that had really boosted morale. Every anecdote painted her as competent, innovative, invaluable. "She reminds me of you in some ways," Marcus said one evening, scrolling through his phone while I cooked dinner. "That same drive to excel, that attention to detail. She's really going places." I wanted to ask why he never talked about me going places. Why my drive to excel at teaching seemed less impressive than Sarah's drive to excel at marketing. But I'd learned by then that questioning Marcus's observations often led to long conversations about my insecurity, my tendency to take things personally, my need to work on my self-confidence. Christmas came and went. Marcus bought me a beautiful necklace and a spa weekend, gifts that felt expensive and impersonal. I gave him a watch I'd saved for months to afford, engraved with our wedding date. He seemed pleased, but distracted. Even on Christmas morning, he was checking his phone, responding to what he claimed were urgent work emails. "Sorry, babe," he'd say, typing rapidly. "Sarah's handling the Morrison account presentation next week, and she's nervous about it. I'm just giving her some encouragement." The new year brought changes I couldn't ignore. Marcus started going to networking events without me, claiming they were boring industry functions I wouldn't enjoy. He joined a gym and began working out before dawn, saying he needed to stay competitive in a young man's business. He bought new clothes, sleeker, more expensive than his usual style. "I need to look the part if I want that promotion," he explained when I commented on his transformed wardrobe. "Sarah's been giving me some advice about professional presentation. She has a good eye for these things." Sarah's name was everywhere now. She'd recommended a new restaurant we should try. She'd mentioned a book Marcus might find interesting. She'd made an observation about office dynamics that had really opened his eyes. It was as if she'd become his primary advisor on everything from career decisions to weekend plans. I started suggesting we invite her and her boyfriend over for dinner, thinking that meeting her might help me understand Marcus's obvious admiration. But there was always a reason why it wouldn't work out. She was too busy with a big project. She'd just broken up with someone and wasn't ready to socialize. She was traveling for work. She's pretty private about her personal life, Marcus explained. Really focused on her career right now. I respect that about her. February brought the promotion Marcus had been working toward. Senior account manager, complete with a corner office and a substantial raise. I was genuinely happy for him, proud of his success, excited about what it might mean for our future plans. But instead of celebrating with me, Marcus wanted to take the team out for drinks. Sarah had suggested this great new cocktail bar downtown. It would be good for his image as a leader, she'd said, to show appreciation for the people who'd supported his advancement. You should come, he offered, but in a tone that suggested he hoped I wouldn't. Though it might be kind of boring for you. Lots of office talk, inside jokes you wouldn't get. I stayed home that night, heating up leftover Chinese food and watching romantic comedies alone. Marcus stumbled in after midnight, smelling like expensive perfume that definitely wasn't mine. Sarah helped me celebrate, he said when I asked about the scent. She's affectionate when she drinks. Lots of congratulatory hugs. That's when I knew. Not the full extent of it, not the elaborate planning and financial scheming I'd discover months later. But I knew my husband was having an affair. I knew the late nights and networking events and professional development conversations were covers for something else entirely. I also knew I wasn't ready to face it. Instead, I threw myself into my work with renewed intensity. I volunteered for every committee at school, signed up to tutor struggling students after hours, applied for a summer enrichment program that would require 60-hour weeks. If Marcus was building a life that didn't include me, I'd build one that didn't need him. But even as I stayed busy, even as I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, the evidence kept accumulating. The way he'd angle his phone away from me when texting. The way he'd shower immediately when he came home from client dinners. The way he'd started suggesting I visit my sister more often, or spend weekends with friends, or take up hobbies that would get me out of the house. You should have your own interests, he'd say when I suggested we spend a Saturday together. It's not healthy for couples to be joined at the hip. Sarah was just saying that independence is really attractive in a relationship. Sarah's relationship wisdom, Sarah's career advice, Sarah's opinion on everything from Marcus's haircut to our vacation plans. She'd become the invisible third person in our marriage, the expert on everything I was apparently doing wrong. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in March. I'd left work early with a migraine and came home to find Marcus's laptop open on the kitchen table, forgotten in his rush to leave for another important meeting. The screen was still logged into his email account. I told myself I was just closing it to save the battery. I told myself I wasn't really looking at anything, just moving the cursor to click shut. I told myself a lot of things as I scrolled through months of correspondence between my husband and his brilliant marketing coordinator. The early emails were professional enough, though warmer than strictly necessary. Compliments on presentations, inside jokes about difficult clients, friendly banter about weekend plans. But as I scrolled chronologically, watching their relationship develop in real time, the tone shifted from collegial to flirtatious to intimate. Missing you already, Marcus had written after a business trip I'd thought he'd taken alone. Last night was incredible. Can't wait until we don't have to sneak around anymore. My hands shook as I opened email after email, each one revealing another layer of their relationship. Photos of Sarah that definitely weren't professional headshots. Details about hotel rooms and weekend getaways and elaborate plans for their future together. Plans that notably didn't include me. But the worst part wasn't the affair itself. It was the casual way they discussed me, as if I were an obstacle to be managed, rather than a human being whose life they were destroying. How much longer do we have to keep this up? Sarah had written just 2 weeks earlier. I'm tired of pretending to care about your boring teacher wife. Marcus's response was clinical in its cruelty. Patience, babe. We stick to the timeline. 2 years and 1 day, then I file for divorce and claim half her inheritance. After that, it's just you and me and more money than we'll know what to do with. I slammed the laptop shut so hard the screen cracked. The sound echoed through our empty house like a gunshot, like the sound of everything I'd believed about my life shattering all at once. My marriage wasn't failing because I wasn't good enough. It was failing because it had never been real in the first place. Every moment of happiness, every shared dream, every promise Marcus had made, it had all been a performance designed to get me to the altar and keep me there just long enough for him to claim half of my grandmother's life savings. I was a mark, a target, a job to be completed. And I had less than 8 months left before they cashed me in. I spent 3 days staring at that cracked laptop screen before I could bring myself to turn it back on. 3 days of calling in sick to work, of ignoring Marcus's concerned texts about why I seemed distant, of lying in bed trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. When I finally opened the laptop again, hands trembling, I found that Marcus had changed all his passwords. He knew I'd seen something. Maybe not everything, but enough to make him careful. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in gaslighting. When I asked direct questions about Sarah, Marcus deflected with concern about my mental state. When I mentioned seeming distant lately, he turned it back on my insecurity and jealousy. When I suggested couples counseling, he agreed readily, then scheduled sessions with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a therapist who coincidentally happened to be Derek's sister-in-law. Emma's been struggling with some trust issues, Marcus explained during our first session, his hand resting supportively on my knee. I think her father's abandonment when she was young has created some attachment anxiety. She started imagining problems in our marriage that just aren't there. Dr. Hendricks nodded sympathetically, taking notes about my unfounded suspicions and, quote, patterns of self-sabotage. When I tried to explain about the emails, about Sarah's constant presence in our conversations, about the way Marcus had been pulling away, she gently suggested that I might be projecting my own fears onto innocent professional relationships. It's very common for people with abandonment trauma to create tests for their partners, she said, her voice maddeningly calm. Sometimes we unconsciously sabotage good relationships because we're afraid of being hurt first. I left those sessions feeling more confused than when I'd arrived. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I'd misinterpreted innocent emails. Maybe my suspicious nature was destroying the best thing that had ever happened to me. Marcus was so patient with my episodes, so understanding about my need for reassurance, so willing to work through my trust issues. The isolation had been so gradual I hadn't noticed it happening. But sitting in my empty house night after night while Marcus worked late, I realized I had no one to call. My college friends had drifted away during the intense romance phase with Marcus. My work friendships were pleasant but surface level. My relationship with Jenna had become strained after Marcus had convinced me she was jealous of our happiness. Your sister's been single for 3 years, he'd pointed out after a particularly tense family dinner. I think seeing us so happy together makes her bitter. Maybe we should give her some space until she works through her own issues. I'd believed him. I'd actually believed that my sister, who'd been my best friend since childhood, was jealous enough of my marriage to be deliberately undermining it. I'd started declining her invitations, keeping our conversation short, pulling back from the one person who might have seen through Marcus's performance. By April, I was living in a bubble of manufactured reality. Marcus controlled our social calendar, our financial decisions, even which TV shows we watched together. He did it all with such loving concern that I felt grateful for his guidance, rather than suffocated by his control. You've been so stressed lately, he'd say when I mentioned wanting to make plans with anyone outside his approval. I just want to protect you from anything that might make your anxiety worse. The anxiety was real. I'd started having panic attacks in the middle of the night, waking up with my heart racing and the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Marcus would hold me through them, stroking my hair and murmuring reassurances about how safe I was with him. It's just your brain trying to process all the changes, he'd whisper. Marriage is a big adjustment, but we'll get through this together. I'd started seeing a different doctor for my anxiety, one Marcus had recommended through his insurance plan. Dr. Williams prescribed medication that made me feel foggy and disconnected, like I was watching my life happen to someone else. When I mentioned that the pills seemed to be making me more confused rather than less anxious, he increased the dosage. Sometimes things get worse before they get better, he assured me, Emma, you're dealing with some deep-seated trust issues that medication can help stabilize while we work on the underlying problems. The underlying problems. Everyone seemed to agree that I was the problem. My jealousy, my insecurity, my inability to appreciate the wonderful husband who was working so hard to build us a future. The medication made it easier to accept this version of reality, to stop asking uncomfortable questions, to just go along with whatever Marcus suggested. That's probably why it took me so long to notice that our joint savings account was shrinking. I discovered it by accident when the bank called about a suspicious transaction on our credit card. I was the primary account holder, something Marcus had insisted on for tax reasons, so they called me to verify a charge for $3,200 at a jewelry store I'd never heard of. "I'm sorry, that must be a mistake," I told the fraud prevention specialist. Neither my husband nor I made any purchases like that. But when I checked our online banking that afternoon, I found months of charges I didn't recognize. Expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together. Hotel rooms in cities Marcus had never mentioned visiting. A recurring monthly payment to something called Sunset Properties, LLC. When I called Marcus about it, he was ready with explanations. The jewelry purchase was a surprise for our anniversary. I'd spoiled it by calling the bank. The restaurant charges were client entertainment expenses he'd been fronting for the company. The hotel rooms were for business trips that had been booked last minute. The monthly payment was for a storage unit, where he was keeping some inherited furniture from his grandfather's estate. All perfectly reasonable explanations delivered with just enough irritation about my lack of trust to make me feel guilty for asking. But that night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my sister. "Emma?" Jenna's voice was surprised, cautious. "Is everything okay?" I almost hung up. Almost convinced myself that Marcus was right about Jenna being jealous, about our family not understanding our relationship. But something in her tone, genuine concern rather than resentment, made me stay on the line. "I think I might be going crazy," I whispered, scared Marcus might overhear even though he was supposedly at another late meeting. "Honey, what's wrong?" And suddenly, it all came spilling out. The emails I'd found and then convinced myself I'd misunderstood. The therapy sessions where I was made to feel like the problem. The medication that made everything feel like a dream. The money disappearing from our accounts. The growing sense that my own husband was a stranger wearing a familiar face. Jenna listened without interrupting, without judgment, without trying to convince me I was imagining things. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Emma," she said finally, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. None of what you just described is normal. None of it is your fault. And you're not crazy." "But Dr. Hendricks said—" "I don't care what Dr. Hendricks said, I care what I see. Do you remember the sister you used to be? The one who stood up to bullies at school, who got a full scholarship to college, who moved to a new city by herself because she wanted to teach. That person didn't just disappear because she got married." I started crying then, deep sobs that felt like they were coming from somewhere I'd forgotten existed. Because I did remember that person. Emma, who'd made decisions based on her own judgment rather than someone else's opinion. Emma, who'd trusted her instincts even when other people disagreed. Emma, who'd known the difference between love and control. "I don't know how to get back to her," I admitted. "We start with small steps," Jenna said. "And the first step is admitting that something is very, very wrong." That night, for the first time in months, I flushed my anxiety medication down the toilet. I was terrified of how I might feel without the chemical buffer, but I needed to think clearly. I needed to remember who I was before Marcus had convinced me I was broken. The withdrawal was horrible. My head pounded, my hands shook, and every emotion felt raw and overwhelming. But underneath the physical discomfort was something I'd almost forgotten. Clarity. The fog began to lift, and with it came the realization that I'd been living in a carefully constructed prison of someone else's making. I started keeping a journal, hidden behind my teaching materials where Marcus would never think to look. I wrote down every inconsistency, every excuse, every moment when his explanations didn't quite add up. I documented the money transfers, the suspicious charges, the patterns I'd been too medicated to notice. And slowly, painfully, I began to see the full scope of what had been done to me. I wasn't having a mental breakdown, I was having a breakthrough. For the first time in months, I was seeing my life clearly enough to understand that I was in danger. Not physical danger, but something potentially worse. The systematic destruction of my identity, my relationships, my financial security, and my sense of reality itself. Marcus had tried to erase me without actually killing me. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated exactly how strong the real Emma had always been. The first thing I did was change banks. Not our joint account. That would have tipped Marcus off immediately. But I opened a new personal checking account at First National across town and started direct depositing my teaching salary there. When Marcus asked why my paychecks weren't showing up in our shared account anymore, I told him the school district was having payroll issues and temporary delays were expected. He accepted this explanation without question, probably because he was too busy planning how to spend my inheritance to worry about my monthly teaching income. My journal became my lifeline. Every morning before school, I'd document anything strange from the previous day. The way Marcus had steered me away from a conversation with our neighbor Mrs. Patterson, the fake phone call he'd taken when I asked about our anniversary dinner plans, the credit card statement that showed charges at a spa in Scottsdale during a weekend he'd claimed to be visiting his sick uncle in Phoenix. Writing it down made it real, made it impossible for him to convince me later that I'd misunderstood or overreacted. I started photographing documents with my phone before he could hide them. Bank statements, his work schedule, even grocery receipts that didn't match the items in our refrigerator. 3 weeks after I'd stopped taking the medication, I called the law office of Catherine Mitchell, an attorney I'd found through online research. I didn't tell Marcus I was seeking legal advice. Instead, I scheduled the consultation during my lunch break and told him I was meeting with the curriculum committee about next year's reading program. Catherine Mitchell was everything Dr. Hendricks wasn't: sharp, direct, and immediately suspicious of my story in all the right ways. "Let me get this straight," she said, reviewing the financial documents I'd printed out. "Your husband convinced you to see a therapist who happens to be related to his best friend. This therapist prescribed medication that made you compliant and foggy. And during this time, significant amounts of money have been moving out of accounts you have legal access to, but aren't being consulted about." "When you put it like that, it sounds really bad," I said. "Emma, it doesn't just sound bad, it is bad. What you're describing is financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and possibly fraud. We need to document everything, and we need to move quickly." Catherine explained that Massachusetts was a no-fault divorce state, but that didn't mean Marcus could just walk away with half my inherited assets, especially if we could prove he'd obtained them through deception. She also warned me that if Marcus suspected I was building a case against him, he might accelerate his timeline or take steps to hide more money. "The element of surprise is your biggest advantage right now," she said. "He thinks he's got you exactly where he wants you. We need to gather evidence while he still believes that." I started doing things I'd never imagined myself capable of. I learned how to check phone records online and discovered that Marcus had been calling and texting Sarah's number dozens of times every day. I figured out how to access our home security system and found footage of Marcus leaving the house on nights when he'd told me he was upstairs sleeping. Most importantly, I reconnected with the parts of myself that Marcus had convinced me were problematic. I called my college roommate Rebecca, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Marcus had suggested that Rebecca was a bad influence because she was divorced and, quote, bitter about marriage. When I apologized for disappearing, Rebecca's response was immediate and fierce. "Emma, I've been worried sick about you. The last time we talked, you sounded like a completely different person, like you were reading from a script." We met for coffee the following Saturday while Marcus was supposedly playing golf with Derek. Rebecca took one look at me and started crying. "Honey, what has he done to you?" she asked. "You used to light up rooms. You used to have opinions about everything. You used to laugh at my terrible jokes." I'd forgotten that I used to laugh easily. I'd forgotten that I used to have strong opinions about books and movies and politics. I'd forgotten that I used to enjoy my own company, used to feel confident in my decisions, used to trust my instincts about people. Rebecca helped me remember. She reminded me about the time in college when I'd stood up to a professor who was grading female students more harshly than male students. She told me about the letter I'd written to the campus newspaper, defending funding for the literacy program. She showed me photos on her phone from our graduation day, where I was beaming with pride and possibility. "This person still exists," she said, pointing to my younger self. "She's just been in hiding." I started small. I bought coffee from a shop Marcus had criticized as overpriced and pretentious. I signed up for a yoga class he'd dismissed as new age nonsense. I picked a restaurant for our date night instead of automatically deferring to his preference. Each small act of independence felt monumental. Each time I expressed an opinion that differed from Marcus's, I expected pushback, manipulation, or another lecture about my need to be more flexible. Sometimes I got those responses, but they didn't devastate me the way they used to. I was building resistance to his influence, one tiny decision at a time. The most important step was reaching out to my parents. Marcus had convinced me they disapproved of our marriage, that my father had made comments about Marcus being too good to be true, and my mother had expressed concerns about how quickly we'd gotten engaged. I'd believed him and had been walking on eggshells around them for months, trying not to give them ammunition for their supposed criticism. When I finally called them directly, I discovered that Marcus had been lying about that too. "Sweetheart, we've been so worried," my mother said when I confessed that I'd been having marriage problems. "We kept trying to reach out, but Marcus always said you were too busy or too stressed to talk. He made it seem like you didn't want to be bothered with family obligations." My father got on the extension, his voice tight with anger I'd never heard before. "Emma, that man has been screening our calls and declining invitations on your behalf for months. We thought you decided we weren't important to you anymore." I started crying again, but this time it was relief mixed with rage. Marcus had stolen my family from me by making each side believe the other had pulled away first. He'd isolated me so completely that I'd felt abandoned by everyone, when in reality, everyone had been trying to reach me through a barrier he'd constructed. That weekend, while Marcus was supposedly at a work retreat in Burlington, I drove to my parents' house for the first time in 6 months. Being in their kitchen, eating my mother's cooking, sitting on the couch where I'd watched countless movies with my father, it felt like stepping back into my own skin. "We knew something was wrong," my mother admitted as we cleaned up after dinner, "but Marcus was so charming, so apologetic about your absence. He made it seem like you were going through a difficult time and he was trying to protect you." "He convinced me you didn't approve of our marriage," I said. My father shook his head grimly. "We approved of your happiness, but you haven't seemed happy in a very long time." They were right. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely happy, as opposed to the anxious relief that came from avoiding Marcus's disapproval. I'd been so focused on being the perfect wife that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be myself. Over the next month, I quietly began rebuilding my life from the inside out. I started reading again, books Marcus had never shown interest in discussing. I began listening to music he'd criticized as depressing or too political. I scheduled regular phone calls with Jenna, Rebecca, and my parents, telling Marcus they were work-related conferences when he asked about my time. I also started taking better care of my physical health. The anxiety medication had made me gain weight and feel constantly sluggish, but as it cleared from my system, I discovered I had energy I'd forgotten I possessed. I started walking after school, telling Marcus I was staying late for tutoring. I bought groceries I actually wanted to eat instead of just the foods Marcus preferred. Most importantly, I began trusting my instincts again. When Marcus told me a story that didn't quite make sense, instead of assuming I'd misunderstood, I started noting the inconsistencies. When he tried to redirect conversations away from topics that made him uncomfortable, I persisted with gentle but firm questions. I was still careful, still playing the role of the compliant wife when he was around. But underneath that performance, I was becoming myself again, stronger, clearer, more determined than I'd been in years. By June, I had a secret bank account with 3 months of living expenses, a lawyer who understood the full scope of Marcus's deception, a family who loved me unconditionally, and friends who reminded me of my worth. I had evidence of financial fraud, emotional manipulation, and an elaborate con that had been in progress for over 2 years. Most importantly, I had something Marcus had tried very hard to take away from me, the absolute certainty that I deserved better than what he was offering. I wasn't ready to confront him yet, But for the first time since I'd discovered those emails, I felt like I might actually win. July 15th, 2 years and 1 day after our wedding. I woke up that morning knowing it was the day Marcus had been waiting for, the day he'd circle on his calendar as the beginning of the end. According to the timeline I'd found in his messages, today was when he would start the final phase of his plan, manufacturing a crisis big enough to justify divorce while positioning himself as the victim. I was ready for him. Catherine had helped me prepare for every possible scenario. My inheritance was now protected in a trust that predated my marriage, technically making it separate property that Marcus couldn't touch. Our joint accounts had been quietly monitored and documented. Most importantly, I had copies of everything: bank records, phone logs, emails I'd managed to screenshot before he'd changed his passwords, even audio recordings from our therapy sessions that Dr. Hendricks probably thought were confidential. I went to work that morning like it was any other day, teaching my summer school reading program and helping struggling third graders sound out challenging words. But underneath my calm exterior, I was electric with anticipation. After months of playing the role of the confused, medicated wife, I was finally going to drop the act. Marcus texted around noon, "Working late tonight, big presentation tomorrow, don't wait up." I knew he wasn't working late. I knew there was no presentation. I knew he was probably planning to spend the evening with Sarah, maybe even taking her to the expensive hotel where they'd been meeting for months. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd hired a private investigator 3 weeks earlier, and tonight we'd finally have photographic evidence of their affair. The investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Chen, had been tracking Marcus's movements with military precision. She'd confirmed the storage unit payments were actually rent for a downtown apartment where Marcus and Sarah had been playing house. She'd documented their dinner dates, their shopping trips, their weekend getaways to the Cape. Most importantly, she'd discovered that Sarah had been wearing an engagement ring for the past month, a ring that had been charged to our joint credit card. I made dinner for one that night, something I'd learned to enjoy during my rebuilding process. Grilled salmon with lemon, roasted vegetables, a glass of wine I'd chosen because I liked it, not because Marcus approved of the vintage. I was finishing the dishes when my phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Got them. Sunset Hotel, room 412. Photos are crystal clear. He's getting down on one knee." The irony was perfect. Marcus was proposing to his mistress with my money on the exact anniversary of the day he'd married me for my inheritance. The symmetry was so poetic it almost made me laugh. I was still smiling when Marcus came home 2 hours later, his hair slightly mussed and that guilty expression he'd been perfecting for months. "How was the presentation?" I asked sweetly, not looking up from the book I was reading. "Exhausting," he said, loosening his tie, "but I think it went well. Sarah really knocked it out of the park with her analysis." Sarah, even now, he couldn't help himself. "That's wonderful," I said. "Sarah's so talented." Marcus studied my face, clearly trying to gauge whether there was sarcasm in my tone. Finding none, he relaxed slightly and headed toward the shower. "I'm beat. Gonna clean up and get some sleep." "Of course, honey, you've had such a long day." The next morning, Marcus was different, energized in a way I hadn't seen since our honeymoon. He hummed while making coffee, checked his phone with a secret smile, even kissed my cheek before leaving for work. "Tonight's going to be special," he said, pausing at the door. "I thought we could have dinner at Giuseppe's, like old times." Giuseppe's, where we'd had our first date, where he'd charmed me with his attention and apparent fascination with my life. The choice was deliberate, calculated to remind me of how happy we'd been in the beginning, how much I stood to lose if our marriage ended. "That sounds lovely," I said. "Should I make a reservation?" "Already done, 7:30. I spent the day making my own preparations. Catherine was on standby with divorce papers that would beat Marcus to the courthouse by hours. Linda had delivered a complete file of surveillance photos that left no doubt about the affair. My parents and Jenna knew what was happening and were ready to provide support if I needed it. Most importantly, I'd made peace with what I was about to do. For months, I'd dreamed about this moment. Imagined the look on Marcus's face when he realized his perfect con had been exposed. I'd fantasized about dramatic revelations and devastating confrontations that would leave him as broken as he'd tried to leave me. But as I got dressed for dinner, I realized I didn't want drama. I didn't want to scream or cry or make a scene that would give him ammunition to use against me later. I wanted something much more powerful, the simple, dignified truth delivered by someone who knew her own worth. Giuseppe's looked exactly the same as it had 3 years ago. The same red checkered tablecloths, the same wine bottle candles, the same elderly Italian man playing accordion near the entrance. Marcus had requested our original table by the window, and he was already seated when I arrived, looking handsome and confident in his best suit. "You look beautiful," he said, standing to pull out my chair, ever the gentleman even when he was planning to destroy me. We ordered wine and made small talk about work, about the summer weather, about a vacation we'd supposedly take in the fall. Marcus was performing the role of devoted husband with the same skill he'd shown since our first meeting, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the way he was measuring my responses and planning his next moves. Halfway through dinner, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Emma, I need to talk to you about something serious." Here it was. The moment he'd been building toward for 2 years. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about our marriage, about our future together," he continued, his voice heavy with manufactured emotion. "And I think we need to be honest about the fact that we've grown apart." I nodded thoughtfully, as if this was the first time I'd considered such a possibility. "I know you've noticed it too," he pressed on, "the distance between us, the way we've been going through the motions instead of really connecting. I think we both deserve better than that." "You're right," I said quietly. "We do both deserve better." Marcus looked relieved, probably thinking this was going to be easier than he'd expected. "I've been talking to a lawyer about how we might handle this amicably. Split everything fairly, start fresh with no hard feelings." "That's very thoughtful of you," I said. "I've been talking to a lawyer too." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty. "Oh, well, that's good. We should definitely both have representation." I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it gently on the table between us. "Catherine Mitchell has been very helpful," I said. "She's shown me some interesting things about community property law in Massachusetts. Did you know that assets obtained through fraud aren't subject to equitable distribution?" Marcus went very still. "Emma, what are you talking about?" I opened the envelope and spread out a selection of Linda's photographs. Marcus and Sarah holding hands outside the Sunset Hotel. Marcus and Sarah kissing in the parking lot of the apartment he'd been renting with my money. Marcus and Sarah at the jewelry store where he'd bought her engagement ring with our joint credit card. "I'm talking about the fact that you married me to steal my inheritance," I said calmly. "I'm talking about the systematic campaign to isolate me from my family and friends. I'm talking about the medication you convinced me to take to keep me compliant while you drained our accounts. I'm talking about Sarah Martinez, your business partner, in more ways than one." Marcus's face had gone white. "Emma, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." I pulled out a copy of the timeline I'd found on his phone, the one that had outlined my destruction month by month. 2 years and 1 day. That was always the plan, wasn't it? Marry me, wait long enough to claim half my assets, then divorce me and ride off into the sunset with your real girlfriend. He started to speak, but I held up my hand. "I also understand that Sarah isn't just your mistress, she's been your partner from the beginning. The marketing coordinator, who conveniently started working at your firm right around the time you met me. The woman who's been helping you plan this elaborate con for over 3 years. I pulled out the final document, a background check Linda had run that revealed Sarah's real identity. "Sarah Martinez doesn't exist," I said. "The woman you've been sleeping with is actually Sandra Williams, a convicted con artist who's been running marriage fraud schemes across New England for the past decade. You're not her first mark, Marcus. You're just her latest one." The color drained from Marcus's face as he stared at the police report, the mugshot, the list of previous victims Sandra had targeted using different identities. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I know her. We planned this together." "You planned my destruction together," I corrected. "But I don't think you planned on her destroying you too. Tell me, have you given her access to any of your accounts? Signed any documents transferring assets? Made any investments she recommended?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. I gathered up the photographs and documents, tucking them back into the envelope. The divorce papers will be filed tomorrow morning. You'll find that I'm not asking for half of anything you actually earned. But every penny you stole from me, every fraudulent charge, every dollar you spent on your fake girlfriend, I want it all back with interest. I stood up, placing money on the table for my half of the dinner we'd barely touched. Oh, and Marcus, you might want to check your accounts when you get home. I have a feeling Sandra has been planning her own exit strategy. After all, why would she stick around to split stolen money with you when she could just take it all and disappear? I walked out of Giuseppe's with my head high, leaving Marcus sitting alone at the table where our relationship had begun, staring at the evidence of how thoroughly he'd been outplayed by everyone in his life, including me. I was right about Sandra. By the time Marcus got home from Giuseppe's that night, she'd cleaned out the apartment they'd been sharing and disappeared with every penny from the 3 accounts he'd opened, in anticipation of our divorce settlement. The engagement ring he'd bought her with my money was sitting on the kitchen counter of their love nest, along with a note that simply read, "Thanks for the fun, but I've got bigger fish to fry." Marcus called me 17 times that night. I didn't answer any of them. The divorce proceedings took 6 months, but they were nothing like the drawn-out battle Marcus had probably expected. Catherine had built such an airtight case that his attorney advised him to settle rather than face criminal fraud charges. Every stolen dollar was returned with interest. The apartment lease was transferred to his name along with the full financial responsibility. He even had to pay my legal fees. More importantly, the restraining order Catherine filed meant Marcus couldn't contact me, couldn't come to my school, couldn't harass my family or friends. For the first time in 2 years, I could breathe without looking over my shoulder. The hardest part wasn't dealing with Marcus, it was learning to trust myself again. Even with all the evidence, even knowing the full scope of his deception, part of me still questioned whether I'd overreacted, whether I'd misunderstood something fundamental. The gaslighting had been so complete that it took months of therapy with a real counselor, one I'd chosen myself, to fully accept that none of it had been my fault. Dr. Rebecca Santos helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just infidelity or even garden-variety financial abuse. It was a sophisticated psychological operation designed to make me doubt my own reality. The fact that I'd eventually seen through it and fought back wasn't luck. It was strength I'd possessed all along, strength Marcus had tried but failed to destroy. "You didn't just survive this," Dr. Santos told me during one of our sessions. "You solved it. You investigated, gathered evidence, built a legal strategy, and executed it flawlessly. That takes intelligence, courage, and remarkable resilience." I started teaching again full-time in September, returning to Riverside Elementary with a clarity and confidence I'd never had before. My students noticed the change immediately. I was more patient, more creative, more present in ways that benefited everyone in my classroom. When you've experienced having your reality systematically dismantled, you develop a deep appreciation for authentic human connection. The house, my house now, fully and legally, became a sanctuary instead of a prison. I painted the walls colors I actually liked, hung art that spoke to me, filled the rooms with plants and books and music that reflected who I really was. Jenna helped me redecorate, and we spent weekends shopping for furniture that had nothing to do with Marcus's minimalist aesthetic. "You're like a butterfly coming out of a cocoon," she told me one Saturday afternoon as we assembled a bookshelf I'd bought purely because it was bright yellow and made me smile. I'm getting to meet the real Emma for the first time. She was right. The woman I became after the divorce was different from who I'd been before Marcus. Stronger, more confident, less willing to accept explanations that didn't make sense, or treatment that fell short of what I deserved. I'd learned to trust my instincts completely, to value my own opinions, to set boundaries that couldn't be negotiated away with charm and manipulation. I also discovered that I had a talent for helping other people recognize the warning signs I'd missed. Through Dr. Santos, I started volunteering with a support group for people who'd experienced financial abuse. My story resonated with others who'd been targeted by similar schemes, and I found purpose in sharing what I'd learned about protecting yourself both legally and emotionally. One evening in November, I was leading a group session when a young woman named Jessica raised her hand. "How did you know when you were ready to fight back?" she asked. "I mean, how did you find the courage?" I thought about it for a moment, remembering that night when I'd flushed the anxiety medication and called Jenna, the moment when I'd decided to start documenting everything in my journal. I realized that the person trying to destroy me had made one crucial mistake, I said. He thought he could erase who I really was. But you can't erase someone who knows their own worth. You can bury it, you can confuse it, you can make them forget it temporarily, but you can't actually destroy it. It's always there, waiting for you to remember. The group nodded, and I saw recognition in their faces, the same awakening I'd experienced when I'd started to see through Marcus's lies. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I got an unexpected phone call. It was Detective Maria Rodriguez from the Boston Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. They'd arrested Sandra Williams, the woman Marcus had known as Sarah Martinez, for running similar cons on 3 other men across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. "Your documentation was crucial to building our case," Detective Rodriguez explained. "The timeline you created, the financial records you preserved, the photographs from your private investigator, it all helped us establish a pattern that we couldn't have proven otherwise." Sandra was ultimately sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Marcus wasn't charged criminally, but his reputation in the accounting world was finished. Catherine heard through professional networks that he'd moved to Colorado and was working as a bookkeeper for a small construction company. I felt something I hadn't expected when I heard that news: pity. Not enough to regret what I'd done, but genuine sadness for someone who'd thrown away every real relationship in his life, in pursuit of money that was never really his to begin with. As for me, I kept teaching, kept volunteering, kept building a life that was entirely my own creation. I started dating again, carefully, with boundaries firmly in place, but open to the possibility that real love might look nothing like the performance Marcus had given me. 2 years after the divorce, I was cleaning out my desk drawer when I found that old journal, the one where I documented all of Marcus's lies and inconsistencies. I flipped through the pages, reading entries written by a woman who'd been desperate to understand why her reality felt wrong, who'd trusted her instincts even when everyone around her said she was imagining things. I kept the journal, not as a reminder of what had been done to me, but as proof of what I'd done for myself. I'd saved my own life in the most literal sense. I'd refused to let someone else's version of reality replace my own. That night, I wrote one final entry. Today I remembered that the strongest person in any room is usually the one who's been tested the most. I was tested, and I didn't just survive, I prevailed. And that knowledge will carry me through whatever comes next. I closed the journal and put it away, not because the story was over, but because the next chapter belonged entirely to me. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.